Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Laura Cesari.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Laura Cesari, and this podcast series is designed for the business leader who's on the go but wants to stay in the know. I try to find companies that are doing unique things in the supply chain to really have us stop and pause and think and try to do things differently to drive value. Today, I am interviewing Martin Rowan, who is with Reveal, and they are working with SAP deployments in a unique way. So let's talk a little bit about Reveal and give the audience a little bit of your background.
Hey Laura, I loved how you introduced the podcast too, because often we feel like we're leaders on the go and everybody doesn't have enough time to do sometimes the right things that will help save time down the road. And I think in many ways that kind of defines who we are as an organization. We're really about trying to put first principles in place, kind of set the foundation for companies to be able to scale and grow and build, the newer technology capabilities like AI of the future. But so often it is stuck, or organizations are stuck because they don't actually have good foundational components in place. And I'm not talking about systematic components. I'm talking about disciplines and behaviors and spreadsheets and etc. So at the heart of it, it's a long way of saying at the heart of it, that's what Reveal does, is we try to build those foundational components and then ensure business performance outcomes, like drive towards actual things that matter, not just billable hours or big transformational projects, but really get the business to see improvements in the metrics that matter, like whether it's service levels or throughput or inventory.
So my understanding of your model is that you go in after a deployment, you don't actually do the implementation, and you look at usage. And are people using the system, and are they using the system well? Which I think is really unique because 70% of the time in my work with clients is focused on selection, implementation, but actual usage and the questions of, am I using this technology well, are never really addressed. So I think it's a very unique business model. And of course, SAP is a market leader in ERP. How did you come about really developing this business model? And, do you find people understand it?
Wow, that's a lot of good questions. I'll tackle it from the start. I think we started in 2005, so we've been at it for 20 years. The sad part about it is that it's still a problem 20 years later. The good news is that it is a reality and it can be solved. So we just realized that, to your point, people put the technology in, and it's not just an SAP problem. This is a software problem, generally speaking.
It's global and it's across all systems. So if anybody addresses this as it's an SAP failure, it's like you're not getting what you need to out of this podcast, because my observation is companies don't use technologies well, and they really do need to spend more time on auditing or observing or analyzing, are people actually using the software to drive maximum value? And there are too few experts in the world, and the users tend to turn over, due to M&A or retirement or natural turn. And so getting the stickiness of usage is, I think, what this is all about. So I just wanted to jump in there to be sure.
I know, and I think it's perfect. Thank you for doing that, because that is exactly right. And actually, as a matter of fact, so when we started in 2005, we realized there's a gap in the market to exactly your point, which is we put it in, and then we don't really know how to run our businesses effectively with it. And so for the last 20 years, we've been keeping track of what that really means and surveying companies. And we have found that 9 out of 10 companies don't believe they're getting the value out of the technology they've implemented. Now, a lot of that's SAP specific, but that can be absolutely broad brush across the board. And then to make matters worse, for those 9 out of 10 that don't feel like they're getting the value, they're underutilizing it by 65%. So that means only 35% of the capabilities of those technologies that they have implemented are actually delivering results for them. And so what happens is organizations, when they underutilize the ERP like SAP like that, they end up finding ways and workarounds. So they start building spreadsheets or bolt-ons, or they develop another report, or they customize this, or they add more people. They've got to create a new department to manage, and it just costs just start bloating, right? And the organizations then that feel like they've won are the only one, are the IT organizations that basically said, hey, we now have a single platform, we have a single ERP, business just needs to get their act together. And the reality is they don't know what they don't know. So they were trained 2 hours, 2 days max. They were given these 5 transactions that they got to learn to run. And then they go like, okay, now go run the business. And it's a little bit like giving your 16-year-old the keys to the car and saying, okay, now here you go. Here's your Ferrari, go and make this hum. And you're stuck in first gear because you really just don't know how to do that. And so a big part of what we like to do is we say, okay, how do we get you to really understand, one, that this is a Ferrari, and how do you become a professional driver? How do we get you to really know how to drive this car well? How does the organization put in the disciplines and structures that keep it going? You know, SAP is a German system, so it kind of requires that German discipline if you want. And it does. It needs that care and feeding continuously to make sure it's working, but not transactionally. And this is a key message that I think people struggle with. They feel like it's just they have to keep working the transactions to move the business forward. This in the supply chain, as a matter of fact, it's just time and quantity, right? And transactions move it from one end to the other. That's basically how it's happening. That's on the informational side. Obviously, physically, there's another movement happening. But what these big ERPs designed, they were designed to actually be rules engines. So a big kind of mind shift for organizations is to say, how do we manage the rules to manage the business, not manage the transactions to manage the business? And that's a paradigm that is lost because most people get, like I say, get taught the transactions. They don't get taught the principles and the parameters. Like how do I utilize MRP effectively? How do I manage my capacities in my production lines? How do I change my schedules? And doing all of that in a scenario-based what if situation in your ERP. And people don't think that it's possible because they think it's a back office technology that just needs to be addressed at some point. And in reality, it is literally the nervous system of your business. And probably in many cases, the single biggest asset investment you've made is your ERP. Hundreds of millions are spent on this. And people come out the other side just worse for the wear. They just feel terribly worn out. And nothing to do with the technology, just to be clear. The technology works. It really does. They've had many years. Can it be better? For sure. But they work. It's fundamentally how we use it.
But let's shift that paradigm of fundamentally how we use it, because I think the user learns as they basically work with the system. And I
Yes.
think there's a need for the discussion about how does this redefine work processes. So if we abstract, we're not just talking about transactional efficiency, but we're talking about rules and policies and the redefinition of work. That's a learning process for an organization. When they first implement, they're kind of naive. I liken it to, I just got a new car and I hate this new car. It has way too many bells and whistles. I don't know how to use it, and the car dealer has this program where you've got to come back every 30 days and ask what gave me a little notebook. But I think that all the bells and whistles can be intimidating to the user. And how do people work together? It's, even worse than how do I drive my car? It's how do these policies and rules, an
Yes.
organization that may not have had policies and rules, best work together to make choices? And I think requires a learning environment.
Yeah, and I love what you just asked about the learning culture because learning comes from doing. It's the same analogy that you used about the car. You don't learn because you've written a test or read the manuscript. It's because you learn to drive by driving. And it's the same with organizations learning to use the ERP to gain the value that they hope to get and drive values, they got to actually do it and learn to do it. And so having a learning culture or learning organization is critical, but learning how to do that while running your job. So that's part of the challenge too. You don't want to pull people out of the business, go put them in a black box and say, okay, learn how to do this in a sandbox environment or in a or with a widget company that's not you. You're an oil and gas company. What does a widget company got to do with me? And it makes no sense. But if people learn to do it in their environment, and they're a chemical company and they can see how the chemicals are being mixed and how I'm using my recipes to do that, and you learn and you have somebody that can actually course correct you as you go along, that's true learning. And then your understanding just increases tenfold because now I have critical thinking. I know the impacts of my actions. I'm not just living in my little silo, and I can see how it's impacting others. And then being able to get everybody to really sing from the same song sheet, which is how do I look at the same set of data? So if I'm in a production facility and I'm looking at the data and it's telling me that something's late, then I can trust that it's late. I don't have to call buying or procurement division and say, hey, is this material really late or is it not available? And the materials guys, when they see a production order change or a sales order changes, they actually can adjust their production or sorry, purchase order because they can see up and downstream and they're all looking at the same set of data. I don't have my spreadsheet and Laura has her spreadsheet and Joe has his, right? It has to be some single sense of similarity and single source of truth. And only then does the integration work. We often talk about how ERP's biggest value is its integration, right? It's blind to silos. It just moves data. But yet it's also its biggest weakness because if we break the integration, it's basically nothing better than a calculator. Then the whole thing just is basically just a very simple calculator for each individual person. And so it's rebuilding integration. And if, as a matter of fact, if you think of integration and you think of supply chains and you think of businesses, that's what it's all about. It is how all of these things work together. And the ERP is absolutely the catalyst for it. And so when we talk about foundationally getting that working, you got to get that in place. You got to have knowledge. You got to have a learning organization. You got to have a right level of education. You got to rebuild the integration and the cross-functional working relationships. And then the technology just flies. Then it hums because now we're all working on the same single set of data.
So how do you engage with a client? How long after they've implemented and what things do you look for?
So we typically say you got to be live at least 6 months to a year, just because there's this hypercare state when you're in where it's just a little bit of chaos and people just need to settle down. And only when the dust has settled does it start making sense to optimize. So we're the optimization side of it, right? Or what often people say is we'll go live and then we'll do continuous improvement. And, we know it never really happens, but they try. We're that phase, right? There's that continuous improvement optimization phase. So it typically happens a year plus afterwards. And then how do we engage? We fundamentally know exactly where the failures are. This is the other thing about it. It doesn't matter whether you're a chemical company, a discrete manufacturer, a food manufacturer or distributor, or even an oil and gas company. There's core things that fail, that make us not get the value. And they quite simply, we don't trust the data that we're looking at. So you got to rebuild trust. They don't trust the master data or parameters. They don't understand the policies. They picked one and peanut butter spread it across all of them. So suddenly everybody's lead time is 10 days. That's not correct, right? So how do we get those parameters to work for us? And then fundamentally the educational piece, like learn how to do the work that you need to do inside of the system. So there's that piece. And then lastly, it's optimization. How do we now, when we've identified the challenges and we've stabilized the process, how do we now optimize it? How do we shrink lead times? How do we shorten sales cycles? How do we reduce costs? How do we increase our turns? Because then you're actually going after real metrics. Right now, most people's metrics is, did I get through the list of things that I had to do today? That's not moving the needle, right? Let the system do the heavy lifting and let us focus on the rules. And so we engage and just sit shoulder to shoulder with the teams and get going together. We're not your traditional consultants. We are really practitioners at heart.
What is your ideal client? What does it look like? Do you engage with like a supply chain center of excellence, with finance, with the VP of supply chain. What's your typical engagement
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, it's usually the office of the COO or the Chief Supply Chain Officer. And those are typically the most committed in terms of getting the operational and supply chain stuff working. CFOs are great components because they obviously have a cost savings mindset and they want to try and improve the business. CIOs can be a door entry just because they obviously, especially if they're visionaries and they can see the value that can be gained from it, and they're not just looking for a technological solution. Because we got to talk about that too. AI is obviously the buzzword of note. And then, but really what it comes down to, those may be the entry points, right? Those are the owners or sponsors, but it comes down to actually working with the people at the coalface. The ones that actually closest to the work are the ones that actually have the biggest impact on how the work is done. And so you actually have to work with those folks. And that takes a lot of energy and change management. You can imagine after 20 years of doing something a certain way, that's an embedded practice now. And if you ask
Right,
them, what's your process? They'll tell you exactly what their process is. They email Sally and then they get a spreadsheet and they upload this and that's their process, right?
right,
So how do
right.
we break that behavior is a big part of it. And the only way to do that is to show them a better way.
All right, so here's the elephant in the room for me is you do this for SAP. This is a unique business model that I have found, but you no one's doing it for other ERP or for supply chain planning or for warehouse management or transportation planning. And I think all technologies have the same issue. My question is why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Why do all companies and all softwares and technologies have a fundamental stuckness, if you want, within businesses? It's got to do with, in particular, the accountability component. Often people tend to think that the software is the one that's going to help drive the business forward, but they don't realize that it's the accountability, the decision making, and the critical thinking on the human side that actually does it. The technology just moves depending on how we set that up and how we tell it to move. And the lack of accountability and lack of leadership often has that. I cannot tell you how many times we've heard, why do we need to do something like this? We've already trained everybody, or we've got 20 people that have SAP in their title. Surely they should be able to, surely they can figure this out. Um, and we've invested all this money, we've given all the tools. Why just go do, right? And there's that misnomer that it's time to invest in the people. And that's so important to understand that you can't just invest in the technology. You have to put the people components in place as well. And that's usually what's missing.
So my takeaway from this podcast are really three things, and you correct me, right? One is there's a need post-implementation, 6 months to a year, to have a coach. And that coaching requires really rethinking policy and roles as it ties to work.
Yeah.
And that it isn't part of continuous improvement as most people know it, that it really requires rethinking based upon having an expert help.
Mhm.
And three, that learning organization just doesn't happen, that it requires an intervention. How did I do?
I think you nailed it. And I think if you take a next level of layering on top of that, then it comes down to what are the rules that we need to deploy, parameters, how do we do that? How do we build that learning organization to remain a stickiness factor where people want to, out of curiosity, want to keep learning? When you put that all in place, we've gotten now to the point after 20 years, Laura, that we can actually now guarantee an 8x return on our clients. We can walk in and help these organizations get 800% return on their investment on the other end of it within 12 months, just because of the fundamentals that you talked about, but also then layering the right disciplines and data behaviors and knowledge. You do that, and organizations can get a massive return out of the business, out of the technology. And that's super exciting because now you're moving into a state of real accountability, real performance, and real outcomes, things that actually matter, like actually cash back in the bank.
Well, from where I sit, I've been studying supply chain planning for a long time. I'm kind of a planning gal. I appreciate ERP, but I'm centered in planning. And
Yeah.
I'm worried that my research shows that 72% of companies are not satisfied with their planning systems, and that over 90% of decisions are made on the back of Excel spreadsheets. But yet I see the focus on let's select a new software, and I see companies
all
that
the time.
go through software after software after software choice and don't really drive value. So, I'm hoping that, some consultants out there learn, and I know you're busy with SAP, but maybe you go into other areas, because the gap, I think, is real, and it's not an SAP gap. I think it is a gap of how do we help humans better use technology to improve supply chain processes. Thanks for being my guest today.
Oh, you're welcome, Laura. And I love how you ended that. It is so critical. And fundamentally, it needs to be in place for the humans to understand it to work, for the data to work, for even AI to work properly. So thank you for having me.
I agree. Thank you.